It's High Minds Entertainment, and we're back today with another mini documentary, and today we're going to be covering Whitey Bulger. James Whitey Bulger is someone who has had a very, very interesting past, and he's someone who has had a lot of chapters in his life that have been covered by a lot of different people. So what we're going to be doing today is taking a different spin on it and seeing if we can explain how and why he became the monster that he is known to be today. James Bulger grew up in South Boston, but that is not where he was born. He actually originally was living in Everett, Massachusetts, but his family had to move to South Boston after his father had an accident. This definitely pushed Bulger into more of a street life and definitely opened his eyes to a different side of the world. James's father was originally from Ireland, and his mother was also a first-generation Irish American, so this gave him a very unique look on life. At this time, the Irish were the immigrants that a lot of people actually looked down upon, and it was very much different than it is today, but it is similar in a lot of ways. We see different groups getting pushed into this box, but it always causes a lot of people to either have a different outlook in a political way or a criminal way. Sadly, after his father had an accident at work, he lost his arm, and that was what caused them to move to South Boston. This also put them into poverty. This really made James become what we know today as Whitey. Apparently though, the police are the ones who coined him with this nickname of Whitey, and this is something that James did not really enjoy as a nickname. He more preferred James or Jim, even Boots, because he kept a switchblade in his boots. But the reason why he was called Whitey is because of his bleached blonde hair. It was something that definitely stuck out, and it was definitely something that gave him a little bit of a leeway on what he could do, because he looked a little innocent. Early on, James was a fighter, but he was more just into petty crime. He wasn't into a lot of the things that we know him for today and what people might assume he was always into. James would find his way into a street gang called the Shamrocks though. This was something that definitely led him to some very unfortunate situations, and one of those situations was him getting into trouble. They were committing robberies and doing all types of different dumb things, which eventually sent him to juvie. This was a place that gave him a little bit of structure, and he definitely learned that he had to figure out a different path. So after juvie, he would actually go into the Air Force. During his time in the Air Force, he would learn a lot about keeping structure and just following the code. And this definitely is something that a lot of people would assume is probably where he would learn how to become a ruler or someone who is an enforcer. But this is definitely a place where he was also still kind of just doing petty nonsense and getting into a lot of trouble. He only actually was in the Air Force for 4 years and eventually was honorably discharged due to just all of the nonsense that he was finding himself in. This definitely gave him a lot of structure and taught him a lot, so I'm not going to discredit this at all, but it is definitely something that wasn't the overall reason for what created this monster that we see. Not too long after being discharged, about 6 years later actually, he would find himself in Atlanta's federal prison. This was due to him getting caught in an armed robbery charge, and there was some other charges along with that, but the armed robbery charge was the overall thing that was keeping him in there. This prison in Atlanta is where he supposedly underwent a very, very well-known experiment that was able to actually get him a big reduction on his sentence. This experiment is widely known as the MK Ultra experiment, where they tested LSD on humans. What is the MK Ultra experiment though? A lot of people just think it's some acid experiment, but what really was the purpose for it? Was it just to cure schizophrenia, or was this for something much greater and much more evil, actually? What the MK Ultra experiment actually is a study on humans to figure out ways in order to actually control the mind. More or less, they were trying to create humanoids that were able to go into situations without fear and without scare of dying. They were trying to create soldiers that would be mindless and easier to control than the ones they have now. Bolger wasn't the only one that was in this experiment though, and he actually did volunteer for this, so at the end of the day, it is what it is. He was under the assumption that it was a trial in trying to cure schizophrenia. This definitely wasn't the case though. It was only for mind control, and it was very much something that was actually happening across a lot of different prisons. But the prison he was in, there was apparently 18 others who volunteered and underwent this trial. One thing I wanted to point out, 18 seems very suspicious. I do see that they had it going for 18 months. They actually were giving him acid for 18 months straight and trying to put him through all these different tests and whatnot. But 18 other people seems a little fishy because they apparently had 19 people total. Just seems very weird to me. Is it possible that one of those people that was the 20th person could have killed themselves or something maybe? It would make a lot of sense, but I have nothing to back that up, so I'm not going to say that's a fact. That is definitely me just speculating. But let's go back on that. 18 months straight, they were giving him LSD. And supposedly during this period of time, what they were doing as a test was they were asking him questions about murder, asking him questions about crimes, and almost seeming to be trying to influence him into committing crimes. There are other people that are very, very well known to have gone under this experiment as well. There's people such as Charles Manson that they say underwent this trial, and it's very likely that is the case because they also say that Charles Manson was giving LSD to all of his different sorts of people who are followers. This is definitely something that I will be doing a bigger video on, so if you're interested in that one, check out my channel. I will be posting a lot more stuff that are very much similar to this one. But with that said, the experiment that happened on Whitey seems to be something where they were attempting to see if they could create a monster and create something that was more controlled than they really were able to do. If we look at Whitey's past, he did have violent situations. He was a fighter, but he was not someone who was committing these murders, burying people in basements, and doing all of this vicious stuff before these trials. So, is it likely? Yes, it is definitely likely that the effects of them trying to see if they could convince him into being a murderer actually paid off for them. It seems to be that the mind control was a success, but it wasn't as controlled as they wanted it to be, so it wasn't something they went further on, or did they?
So the CIA claims that it was a huge waste of time and money, and that they actually got no real benefits out of this experiment, and that it was more or less just a convenient operation to attempt to see if it would work. Of course, this is definitely not the full truth. This definitely leaves out a large part of what they actually were intending on trying to find out, and also leaves out a lot of things that could be possible for the use of it still. So it's very possible this is still a very useful, or maybe not useful, but a very effective tool to be using that is going to be a little bit hard to control. With that said, it's definitely still going to be something that's effective and very much going to take away a lot of credibility from anyone that you use it against. But Bulger actually didn't fully go through the full experiment. He actually eventually tried to escape from Atlanta Federal Prison. There's a lot of reasons that I would assume is the reason why he attempted to, but if we look at it in the bigger picture, when someone is experimenting with all of these different psychedelics and they are expanding their mind in this type of way, it's going to be very, very difficult to stay within a very small, confined area. It's definitely going to be something where you want to get out. Whether it's going to be a very smart strategy on how to actually escape, that was up to him. And clearly it wasn't that effective because he was eventually caught. But when he got caught, they actually sent him to Alcatraz. He would finish off his sentence over in Alcatraz, which is very interesting to me because obviously Alcatraz is a very confined place that is no longer in use, but it's also a place that Bulger said that he very much enjoyed, and he said that he really loved Alcatraz much more than all of these other places, which is kind of a weird thing to say, of course. Bulger, even on his headstone, wanted them to put a quote where he was saying that he would rather be at Alcatraz, which is very, very strange. But at the end of the day, when you are institutionalized in that type of way and you are also experimenting with all of these mind-bending hallucinogens, then kind of makes sense, I guess. But after his sentence in Alcatraz, when he would get out, this is when the monster was really ignited, and really when we started to see something that was very fearful for most people who lived in South Boston. After his release, the way he found a way into power in South Boston was by being an enforcer, being a foot soldier. And originally he actually was a janitor, and that was what he was doing just to pass time, to kind of make himself look good in the eyes of his parolee, and it worked. He was doing the janitor job and also doing construction work, and it was definitely getting time by. But he found his way into a very, very interesting little gang, which was actually hosted by these three brothers, Donnie, Eddie, and Kenny. But also a very known face for that gang was Billy Sullivan, which wasn't really a very popular gang. It was more or less something that was of that era, and it was something that was very known in that era. But they were going to war with the Mullins. The Mullins were also another group who wasn't necessarily on a massive level. None of the gangs or any of the crews at this level or at this time were on a really high level of prestige and stardom. It was more or less the smarter way of going about it if you stayed unknown. And being a foot soldier was something that very much taught him a lot. It also gave him a lot of access to a lot of other people who were ready to commit these style of crimes. And one of these people was Stephen Flemmi. Flemmi was someone who was known as the Rifleman because he was in the Vietnam War, and he was someone who was very much a sharp shot when it came to being pinpoint with his accuracy. With that said, Flemmi was also a savage. He was someone who was trained to kill, and he was also someone who seemed to kind of enjoy it a little bit more than the other people, at least. Bulger says that Flemmi was someone who brought out the worst in him, and it was someone who was almost a terrible person to keep around, because obviously it was someone who encouraged him to commit these style of crimes, but also was someone who kind of made it a competitive thing for him to outdo, which is very interesting to see. Bulger seems that he was very much influenced in a lot of ways, not only through Flemmi, not only through his interesting experiments with MK Ultra, but also just someone who very much wanted to be known but not known. He seemed to be someone who wanted to be respected and feared, but he also wanted to kind of stay under the eyes of the people who he needs to. But with all of this said, everyone already knows where this is going. Everyone knows that Bulger went on a very, very interesting reign of terror and just brutal situations of him burying people in basements, doing all types of violent things to people. And it is what it is. At the end of the day, a lot of people feared him for very good reasons, but they also didn't know the full story. So presenting the full story, I think, is essential for everyone to understand how someone could get to this mindset and how people can learn how to stay away from this type of mindset, I guess. But it is also something that we can see is something that it's something that we can't necessarily learn much from, because it is very hard for anyone else to fall into this situation of them going through a extensively long period of being experimented on with acid. That is something that is obviously going to mentally fuck you up and put you into some insane thought space. So for them to be questioning if he was a killer and trying to ask him if he will ever kill while he's experimenting with hallucinogens is obvious why it had the result that it had. And for any person with any self-awareness or logic behind them, they're going to understand that. So as much as anyone's going to think I'm sympathizing and looking at this as a way of making excuses for him, it's not. It's clearly just a way of us learning as people and seeing what it is and taking the mask off of what we're actually looking for. So I hope this was done in a way that people actually followed along with and enjoyed. But there's going to be much more coming on this similar topic. So if you enjoyed this one, definitely check out more of the content. Much love.